this is Mrs. Murdock, and during our review session today, I want to touch really quickly on feedback pathway. So there's two types. There is negative feedback versus positive feedback. And I already had a little video that I made of myself just going over negative feedback and the anabolic steroid example in particular. So that's already in the 4D folder. If you wanted to go see that, that is there. But just a really quick overview of these two different types of pathways and what kind of examples you would see. So for negative feedback, which is the much more common type of regulation, right? What we're doing is we're turning on some kind of a pathway, and then the last thing in the pathway feeds back to turn off the original signal. So you have a way of switching something on and then switching it off. That's the most common way to regulate these hormone pathways in the body. Positive feedbacks are a little more rare. That's when something contextual that's not chemical is going to eventually turn off the pathway and not the chemistry. So that's when the last thing in the cycle doesn't turn it off, it actually ratchets it up and makes it go even more. Okay? So if I were to draw this in terms of flow charts, which I know always makes it a little more easy to understand, let's say that we have, you know, a gland that produces chemical A that tells gland number 2, gland 1, 2, to make some B, which then stimulates some kind of response chemical. Response chemical C, okay? In negative feedback, what happens is when C builds up to a certain point, it negatively, here I'll use red, negatively will feed back to the original gland and turn it off, thus switching off both gland 1 and gland 2's secretion of the chemicals that eventually led to C in the first place. That's pretty much simple negative feedback. Almost every example that we've looked at works like that. So the thyroid example is a really nice linear example. The thyroid hormones, once you have the thyroxine being secreted by your thyroid gland, it will build up and then go back to the hypothalamus and say, okay, we don't need any more releasing hormone, right? Classic negative feedback. What was the other one? The testosterone example is also negative feedback, right? So not thinking about anabolic steroids getting in the way here, but just the natural pathway in the male human body. You start with the hypothalamus here, and then you have the pituitary, and then the testes secrete testosterone. And when the testosterone builds up, it feeds back and turns off the beginning steps, right? So there's negative feedback. The examples, if they don't give you those examples, they might say something like, they'll give you a pathway and say that the final chemical is going to decrease this, right? If they say that, if the final chemical is feeding back and decreasing something, that's negative feedback, okay? So positive feedback, which is less common, okay? Positive feedback is where maybe you have that gland number 1 that secretes chemical A, and then you have gland number 2 that secretes chemical B, and then you have some sort of response. Okay, response C. So in this case, I'll even use green for go, this chemical positively feeds back and say, oh yes, we want more of that, right? So now the final chemical feeds back and says, let's stimulate these glands even more and get more of this response going because we need it. The one example that I can think of for this is oxytocin that's secreted when a woman is in labor having a child. Okay? So oxytocin is a hormone that actually is secreted by, I think it's by the pituitary, and its response is to increase uterine contractions to get the baby out, right? So you have oxytocin, and I don't know what the in-between chemicals are, but the response is contractions, okay? Uterine contractions, because we're in childbirth, and the contractions stimulate more and more and more of it. And then since you don't have a chemical that's negatively feeding back, in this case, it's when the baby is out that shuts down the process, right? So it's just a little bit different. It's positive feedback tends to be in situations where it, instead of responding to a chemical, it responds to something else contextually that's stopping in the body, okay? So with positive feedback, you'll be given examples where the final thing doesn't decrease the first step, it increases it. So that's what you need to remember in terms of that difference. You feel clear about that? Excellent. Okay. And I hope that was helpful.